I'm Helen Evans. I'm the Mary and Michael Jaharis Curator for Byzantine Art in the Department of Medieval Art in the Cloisters at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And as I hope all of you who are here know, we have just opened the exhibition Byzantium and Islam, Age of Transition, that focuses on the 7th to 9th centuries as the southern provinces of the empire rule from Constantinople become part of the important core of the emerging Islamic world, and what ideas go forward and what changes in the process. So today we have some very distinguished speakers in a program that is sponsored and made possible by Frosho Bays and gifts given in her honor, and by Mr. and Mrs. John Bilimatsus. And we are doing this event in conjunction with Yeshiva University, and we're delighted to be partnering with them today. Professor Stephen Fine, who spoke Sunday, and the Sunday at the Met is somewhere in the audience, but I can't quite see him. The first of our speakers is on the destruction of images in 8th century Palestine, which is a topic that Robert Schick, a research fellow at the American Center of Oriental Research in Amman, Jordan, is particularly able to speak on brilliantly because he has been involved in the excavation and study of this material for decades and took me on a wonderful tour of the sites when I first went to Jordan asking for these loans for this exhibition. So I cannot imagine anyone who will know more or be more useful to you in trying to understand these issues. He has spent many years in Jerusalem. He has taught at universities all over the world and is just a very, very exciting scholar. So I hope you'll help me welcome Professor Schick.
Yes, well, thank you for the introduction. Well, for my presentation this afternoon, I want to present the puzzling questions involved with attempting to understand what's going on with so many churches in the modern area, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, where at some point, more or less in the 8th century, people choose to deliberately destroy the images of people, animals in the mosaic floors that are in just dozens and dozens and dozens of churches around in the area. Now, I wish I understood what's going on, but I don't really, because there are so many oddities of this, what's involved with this episode of deliberate destruction of the image, of which you see one spectacular example in this first photograph, where there had at one point been a person shown, but has been artistically altered and turned into a lovely plant. So this is a case of disguising an original image in a way that is being done artistically. Well, there are then dozens of examples of especially churches with mosaic floors filled with images that have this deliberate scrambling of cubes of the mosaic floor. Someone comes around, lifts the cubes out, scrambles them up and puts them back in place in a way that's done carefully enough that you can sort of see what the original image was, but the in some way offensive image has been scrambled up enough that it's no longer bothering anybody. And so then here you can see there are 4 people lined up there, and you can still sort of detect the outlines of the figures there. Well, so there's basic questions that I wish I would be able to answer, but I'll try to present what the problems are. Just what is this damage, destruction that's going on, and What's the area in which this damage occurs, and who did it? When did it happen, and why? They're all open questions that have multiple, answers conceivable, but I can't really definitively say I can answer any of these questions or explain just what's involved here. Well, so then in general, most cases you have scrambling up of the mosaic cubes of the complete figures here at one of the churches at the site of Rasas in Jordan, where you have the head and most of the upper body of the image that's in the floor. You have the cubes taken out, scrambled up, and put back in place. This is a typical example of what goes on in most of the cases of these dozens of mosaic floors in the area. And it's not just people, you have animals as well. In this case, this at one point had been a bird. You can't really tell, but well, from other examples, it was a bird there. The tail was there, and the head's there anyway. Again, the cubes scrambled up. In this case, with some artistic sensitivity, with this little vase or bowl put in as an attractive design where the bird had once been. So it's not just human beings, it's all sorts of animals, birds, fish, lions, bears, sheep, goats, whatever. So it's every sort of living being in these mosaic floors get deliberately damaged or destroyed, or the cubes scrambled up. In this case, another case, you have a church at a site in Amman dated by its dedicatory inscription to 687 AD, where the people have removed the cubes of the head of the peacock and the legs, leaving the rest of the body more or less intact, and in this case not putting the cubes back, but simply leaving the damaged image this way. Removing the head and the feet was enough in this case to resolve the problem of this offensive image without the people here seeing the need to scramble up or destroy the entire body of the animal. Well, then another example in the city of Madaba in Jordan, where you see the entire mosaic floor originally was filled with images of people and animals, row after row, all the way through the entire church, where the cubes have been removed carefully so you can normally tell what the original image had been. Various animals, you can still see the outlines. Here there was a person riding an elephant in that one. In this case, the cubes were not put back, but simply left with the bedding of the mosaic floor exposed. And in this case, then they weren't putting the cubes back as they were in the earlier examples that we had seen. But then again, all of the images here, people, animals, get destroyed. And this is then sort of a puzzling question. Well, this is not exactly the same thing as what's going on with iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire, more or less at the same time in the 8th century, where in the Byzantine Empire, there's a period of time when Christians decide that the veneration of icons is not appropriate, so they destroy icons. Icons being images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, the saints that are worthy of veneration in the churches. And so that's the problem in the Byzantine Empire with iconoclasm. These are not icons. They're depictions of ordinary people, ordinary animals. They're not subject to veneration. And so this phase of deliberate destruction in these churches in the area of Israel, Palestine, Jordan is not really iconoclasm. That's not an appropriate word to use. Here it's the destruction of images in general. And now then other cases where you have an image removed, and in this case you can't tell what the original image was. They've taken the cubes of the image away and just patched it with larger sized, different plain white mosaic cubes, and so you can't tell what was originally there, but you know there had to have been an image there, because it's not just accidental damage, it's very deliberately focused where an image of an animal would once have been. And so then other examples where the damage is not done as carefully or as artistically as in some of the earlier examples that we saw. This is one of the more elaborate cases of the deliberate damage. There was a hope to have this included in the exhibition at the Met, but unfortunately at the end it didn't work out. This is the most humorous example of the deliberate elimination of an image that's being done very carefully in an artistically appealing way to have the mosaic look attractive when the operation is finished. And I hope you can see that originally there was a bull here. You can see the hind legs, the tail, the front legs, and a little bit of the hump of the back of the bull that originally would have been depicted here. And this inscription is a quote from the Bible, "And the lion and the bull will lie down and eat fodder together." It's an image of peaceful paradise when lions and bulls will be peaceably living together. So there's a bull here, a lion would have been over here, and someone has very artistically removed the bulk of the body of the bull and put in a tree, and a funny-looking tree there, and then this vase and vine scrolls, very artistically done to replace the image of the bull that's no longer acceptable, but then leaving a little trace of what the image originally had once been. And just another example of one of the dozens and dozens of cases of this, where what you realize what's going on isn't so totally clear. Well, originally, if you look at just these two images, you might say, well, that's rather careless. It's not carefully following the outlines of the animals the way the earlier examples were. So you might say, well, that's just accidental. But then you look here and here and here, you again realize you have the animals with the cubes removed so carefully that you can still see the outlines of the original animals. But then when you look further, you see that this image was destroyed, but this one is left completely intact. And you have a bird here, a bird here, a bird here that were completely destroyed, but then the birds here are left undamaged. You have a obliterated bird here and here and here, but then undamaged birds here and here. And so in this case, about half of the animals are destroyed. The other half are left undamaged, which is peculiar. What's leading the people to get rid of some of the images, but not others? And I wish I could explain this, but I can't. And there are other examples where some or most, but not all of the images are removed. In other cases, every single one of the dozens of images in any given floor are, in fact, damaged. Others where it's sort of only partially done, and I can't just quite figure out just what's going on here. Well, another sort of puzzle with just what the people have in mind when they are doing this destruction of images comes in a church in Jordan at the site called Asas, where of the more than 100 different images of people and animals, we've seen a few previous photos of some of the damaged mosaics at Asas here. All of them are destroyed except for this one fish in a bowl. So every other single image in this mosaic floor, of more than 100 of them, are damaged except this one. Now, what's special about this fish? It's not any special location within the mosaic floor, but they deliberately choose to leave this one undisturbed. Now, the thought occurs to me that this is a dead fish. It's in a bowl, whereas all the other images are alive. They're depicting animals that are alive, but this one is dead. Well, is that the reason? Well, maybe, maybe not. As with so many other puzzling features, I can't think of any better reason why they would leave this one image undamaged in the floor. Well, anyway, and so then also in this same floor, it gets even more curious with this depiction of the Nile River, with then these two boys in the boats that have their heads scrambled up. And there was a depiction of a phoenix here. You have a sun disk with sun rays of what had been a depiction of a phoenix, which are then destroyed like all the other images in this mosaic floor, except in the patch, they put a fish. Now, this I find really weird. If you are taking the effort to get rid of all of the images of living beings in your mosaic floor, why in your patch would you put a living being? Why would you put a fish in the patch of your attempt to get rid of all of the images of living beings? And so this puzzles me no end as to what these people in this church think they are trying to accomplish by obliterating all of the images except that fish in the bowl and this fish in the patch. And so I cannot account for this at all. One of the many mysteries with each mosaic having its own idiosyncrasies, and that's the really most peculiar feature just of why these people are doing what they do, in general wanting to get rid of their images, but so many peculiarities when they don't do it thoroughly, don't do it carefully, or put an image in place of an image. Well, there are dozens of churches where this damage occurs. I drew this map a few years ago. There are further excavations every year that produce one or two more examples. And this map has filled up a little bit since I drew this a few years ago. But it's, again, a peculiarity, the limited geographical area where this damage has occurred. It's only within modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan. Nowhere else. Not in Syria, not in Lebanon, not in Egypt, not in North Africa, not in Anatolia, Greece, the Balkans. Nowhere else does this damage occur except in this small geographical area. No. There is one example in far north Syria, but otherwise it's all this limited geographical area. And so what's so special about this small region as opposed to everywhere else in the Eastern Mediterranean, I don't understand. There are plenty of other mosaics from the early Islamic period that might have been damaged if people elsewhere had wanted to do this damage. This, for example, a mosaic in a church in Syria dating to 722 with its dedicatory inscription that most definitely was not damaged. And so I can't really adequately explain why the damage is focused to this very small geographical area. Well, One of the more recent discoveries of a mosaic floor with this kind of deliberate damage was discovered in the spring of 2009 at a church just south of Amman as the government was widening the main road to the airport, slicing through the hill, just leaving that to be excavated as a salvage project by the Department of Antiquities. And you have then this church with I don't have a good photo of the mosaics, but it suffers the same kind of deliberate damage. And what's curious about the dedicatory inscription is that we have a reference to the patron of the church being the Arab tribal leader Al-Mundhir, the Ghassanid tribal leader at the end of the 6th century, and then it's built under the aegis of the Bishop Palaeoctos and, curiously, 2 servants named Abdullah and Dionysius, with these curious Arabic and Hellenistic names being the servants under whose auspices this church gets built at this time at the end of the 6th century. Well, Al-Mundhir is known to be a supporter of those Christians who rejected the theological pronouncements at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 about the nature of Christ. And so we have many of these churches are being used by people who approve of the proceedings of the Council of Chalcedon, but also churches with opponents of the Council of Chalcedon. So every Christian denomination in the area are doing this damage. It's not one Christian group and another doesn't. It's everybody, both Chalcedonians and people who oppose the Chalcedonians. So every Christian group is doing this damage. And there's other churches where you definitely have opponents of the Council of Chalcedon doing the damage. Other churches that are definitely Chalcedonians, they're doing it. So every Christian group is doing it. Also, we have the question of Jews are also doing this deliberate damage. And you may know that Jews have no problems with having images in their mosaic floors, this spectacular zodiac from a synagogue in northern Israel, a place called Beit Alpha, where Jews are perfectly comfortable having images of zodiacs or whatever in their synagogues. But there are also then some examples where in synagogues this same deliberate elimination of images is happening. And there's one very good example, a synagogue called Susia, south of Hebron, where we have a very clear example of a synagogue suffering this same amount of the deliberate damage. And so it's clear it's this desire to get rid of images transcends Christian theology. It's also Jews doing the same thing at the same time. Well, and so then the question, when is this damage happening? There are a number of churches that have dated dedicatory inscriptions, so the damage has to have happened after the date of the inscription. So it is happening after the dates on this list. Most interestingly, after 762, that's the latest mosaic floor in which there are images that then later on get deliberately destroyed. This 832 is a highly speculative date, but anyway, 762 looks to me that it serves as also the date after which these other earlier floors also were damaged. And this date puts us into the Abbasid period. The Abbasid revolution of 749-750 is when the Abbasid line of caliphs replaces the earlier Umayyad line of caliphs, and there are major social, political, economic changes that take place as a result of the coming to power of this new line of caliphs in 749, 750. Well, one thing then, it seems to me that this deliberate damage is happening then in the first decades after the Abbasid revolution of 749, 750. And one manifestation of this early on is the choice of Christians to no longer install mosaics with images. We have a mosaic here that is purely geometric in design, dated 756. 6 years after the revolution, the Christians are choosing to have mosaics that are purely geometric, no longer with images in them. And is this just happenstance, or is this reflecting a changed social situation where Christians are saying, well, we don't like images anymore, we'll put in a new mosaic floor that's purely geometric? Well, then the last mosaic floor that has images in it is this one dated to 762. All of the later mosaic floors, there's a handful still later, are then purely geometric, or have the vegetal designs, no longer any with images after this one of 762. So I'm sort of thinking that this is happening sometime in the early Abbasid period, and this is an example of this church, the 760, showing the details of the type of damage that's happening. Well, so then the motivation why remains the big question. Why are Christians and Jews in the first decades of the Abbasid period obliterating their images? There's no obvious Christian or Jewish theological motivation for this. There's no explicit literary source that says in the year so-and-so the Christians and the Jews damaged their images. I'm inclined to think it's all happening more or less the same time in these early years of the Abbasid period, with perhaps a response to a hardening attitude that the Abbasid government is now adopting towards their non-Muslim population. There's another manifestation of something that the Christians are doing also more or less at the same time that they're damaging the images, is that the Christians are coming to realize that they are in fact not any longer citizens of the Byzantine Empire. It's now 120, 130 years after the Muslim conquest of the 630s, and it's at this point that the Christians stop proclaiming themselves as loyal citizens of the Byzantine state. Up until the early years of the Abbasid period, in the mosaic floors, they continue to date their mosaic floors by the Byzantine dating system of the Byzantine provinces that were in use throughout the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. It's only after the Abbasid Revolution that the Christians stop using Byzantine dates and they use a more religiously neutral creation of the world era that is no longer proclaiming themselves as citizens of the Byzantine Empire as late as 756. All of the later mosaics use this neutral era of their creation of the world. I'm inclined to think that this choice of the Christians to no longer be loyal Byzantine citizens is somehow connected with the choice of the Christians and the Jews as well to get rid of their images, perhaps in response to a hardening attitude of the Abbasid authorities against the non-Muslim population. But this is all speculation, as so many other issues involved with this episode of deliberate damage. You can sort of see what they're doing, but understanding why in the absence of any great useful literary source, remains a speculation. But I think it's an event of the early Abbasid period in response to Muslim governmental policy, but then maybe it isn't. Well, anyway, questions that I don't think I'll ever be able to solve myself, and something maybe somebody in the future will be able to figure out better than I have. Well, so thank you for your attention.
As you can see, many things in this exhibition are still open for discussion and debates and new evidence being revealed. And Arnold Franklin of Queens College is one of the people leading into a new generation of scholarship, particularly on Judaica, and will soon publish This Noble House, Jewish Descendants of King David in the Medieval Islamic East, with focus on the profound concern with genealogy, which leads him, of course, to the Cairo Geniza documents, which we are increasingly using not only for the studies of issues dealing with Jewish history, but of the history of the region and for all of the people there. So we're very excited to welcome Professor Franklin.
Before I start, let me just say thank you to Helen Evans and to her staff and to the Metropolitan Museum for organizing this stimulating symposium. I also want to express my admiration for the excellent job they did in organizing this very timely and important exhibition. A number of the items in the Byzantium and Islam exhibition come from a source that, while familiar at least in name to specialists, still remains something of an unknown quantity even to the most well-educated of laymen. I'm referring to the unique trove of Jewish manuscripts known as the Cairo Geniza, which first came to the attention of the scholarly community a little over a century ago. Today, I will address the Geniza's relevance to what I think is one of the core themes of the new exhibition, namely the exchange of goods and ideas between confessional or religious communities. Along the way, I'll also introduce you to some interesting items that you won't see in the exhibition, but which I think extend and deepen issues raised by it. While the Geniza materials, as we will see, are a bit later, chronologically speaking, than most of the items in the exhibition, they are nonetheless very much a significant byproduct of the 7th to 9th century world that it portrays. Let's begin just by clarifying what a Geniza is and what makes the Cairo Geniza such a special one. According to an ancient Jewish taboo that is still observed by some today, writings of a religious nature that have become damaged, worn out, or otherwise unusable must not be discarded with ordinary refuse, but instead are to be disposed of in a respectful manner, in a way commensurate with their intrinsic sanctity. Of particular concern was avoiding the desecration of God's name, which things like Torah scrolls, prayer books, etc., tend to contain in prodigious quantities. The term Geniza is used in two senses. It describes the practice of appropriately hiding away or concealing religious texts, as well as the site or receptacle in which such writings were eventually consigned. While local communities followed a variety of practices, most often the custom of Geniza was observed by burying the writings in a cemetery, much as one would solemnly inter a human body. The Cairo Geniza is perhaps the most renowned example we have of this ancient custom's implementation. It is the historian's good fortune that it is also a most atypical Geniza. We can be certain that the Jewish communities of Egypt knew of the more conventional practice of burying discarded sacred texts. But for reasons that still remain obscure, over the course of centuries, the Jews of Fustat and Cairo preferred to dispose of their sacred writings in an above-ground storage room in a local house of worship, a site today known as the Ben Ezra Synagogue, but in the Middle Ages as the Synagogue of the Jerusalemites or the Synagogue of the Palestinians. And here you see a photograph from the upstairs balcony of the synagogue. In one way or another, it was in continuous use by Egypt's Jewish community from the 11th century on, which in and of itself is really quite remarkable. It was renovated several times, most recently in 1991, a few years before this photograph was taken. And here we see a photograph of the entrance to the chamber itself where the manuscripts were accumulated, which was located in the upstairs balcony. The significance of the decision to create a Geniza indoors cannot be overstated. Kept in a sealed, dark room and exposed only to Egypt's desiccating climate, the mostly paper documents were given an infinitely better chance of survival than they would have been had they been subjected to the damp soil as prevailing custom dictated. There is a second reason that the Cairo Geniza stands out as a unique collection, and that has to do with the kinds of materials that were deposited in it. As we might expect, it contained in great abundance pages from biblical texts, rabbinic works, liturgical pieces, and writings of a mystical or speculative nature, some of which were virtually unknown before the Geniza's discovery. But in addition to these, and again for reasons that are not entirely clear, the Jews of medieval Fustat in Cairo also relegated to their Geniza writings that we might characterize as secular. Under this rubric fall things like the records and accounts of the local Jewish community, dockets from the local Jewish court, business agreements, merchants' inventories, marriage contracts, divorce certificates, and correspondence of all sorts. Such documentary materials, as scholars tend to refer to them, constitute an invaluable source of first-hand information for the social historian. They contain a dizzying array of detailed information about daily life. From them, we learn about the kinds of foods people ate, the clothes they wore, what their houses looked like. We hear about the day-to-day challenges of family life and the pressures of work and the struggle to earn a livelihood. There's nothing comparable for any other period of pre-modern Jewish history, and given the lack of archives in the Muslim world before the 16th century, they are of tremendous importance for historians of Islamic civilization as well. There were other kinds of surprises in the Geniza, too. Pages from Arabic literary texts, like the beautifully illuminated Kalila wa Dimna that you see here, also show up in the Geniza. And even more tantalizing, though perhaps somewhat less visually stunning, are copies of Islamic religious texts. Here we are looking at 2 pages from a copy of the Quran. As some of you may be able to recognize, it's written in Hebrew characters. The language is Arabic, but the script is Hebrew, indicating that it was intended for a Jewish audience. That Jews should have been interested in reading the Quran isn't in and of itself all that surprising. One scholar has plausibly observed that texts such as this would have been used by Jewish authors of anti-Islamic polemical treatises, which indeed exist. That may be, but the fact that a Quran in Hebrew script found its way into a repository ostensibly for sacred Jewish writings might also suggest that someone, at some point, mistook this for a Jewish holy book. Whatever the case may be, the unusually broad application of the practice of Geniza in medieval Fustat presents us with an unparalleled window onto the social, cultural, and religious history of a significant community. As early as the 18th century, European travelers, scholars, and collectors started to take notice of the Geniza, and from time to time, those who made their way to Cairo managed to acquire some of its contents for their own personal libraries. A major turning point came in 1896 when Solomon Schechter, a professor of rabbinics at Cambridge University, who was in the midst of a contentious scholarly disagreement, was shown a scrap from the Geniza that clinched the dispute in his favor. With the zeal of the newly converted, Schechter set off for Cairo and in short order had succeeded in procuring all of the remaining manuscripts for Cambridge University's library. Altogether, a staggering 250,000 manuscripts, or close to 750,000 individual pages, were removed from the Geniza and are currently dispersed among some 20 research libraries and private collections in the US and Europe. While manuscript pages were consigned to the Geniza more or less continuously from the 11th century until shortly before Schechter's arrival in Cairo, the lion's share from the material dates from between the years 1000 and 1250, which is often called the classical Geniza period. Here we see a photograph from 1898 of Schechter, surrounded by heaps of Geniza manuscripts. It was taken in a special room in the Cambridge University Library that was set aside for sorting the newly acquired materials, a room that one contemporary observer described as the Cairo apartment. This is an extremely famous photograph. Recently, Schechter's pose here has been described as that of a, quote, rabbinic version of Rodin's The Thinker, which I think is really fantastic. But what I want to call your attention to today are the other elements of the picture and the way they form a study in contrasts. On one hand, we are struck by the stateliness and composure of the physical space. The room is grand, spacious, and well-proportioned. It has high ceilings and intricately carved windows. The walls are clean and spare. On the other hand, we can't help but take note of the element of chaos introduced into this scene by the manuscripts. They appear as disheveled and unruly intruders who seem to have infiltrated and thrown into confusion the formerly tranquil setting. This wonderful image is a useful metaphor for the point I really want to stress today, namely the messiness that the Geniza introduced into much of what historians thought they understood about the way religious communities interacted in the medieval Islamic world. The neat and overly simplistic categories that we often fall back upon, the idea that Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in more or less ghettoized communities, these are complicated in substantial ways by the documents from the Geniza. What follows are a number of illustrations of this theme. My first example actually focuses on contacts between groups within the Jewish community itself, groups that were once thought to be sworn enemies. A major fault line in medieval Jewish society involved the authority of rabbinic tradition, that is, the exegetical interpretations and ritual norms found in the Talmud and other related works. On one side of the divide were those Jews who were loyal to the teachings of the rabbis and who regarded them as the definitive expression of the divine message. We refer to them as rabbinites, and their spiritual heirs constitute the overwhelming majority of today's Jews. On the other side of the divide were those who rejected the teachings of the rabbis, viewing them as, at best, unwarranted innovations, and at worst, as outright distortions of God's intentions. They proclaimed their allegiance to Scripture alone, and it is on this basis that they came to be known as Karaites, or scripturalists. The Karaites' religious stance resulted in a number of significant divergences in the practices of the two communities. Karaites used different methods for the ritual slaughter of meat and rejected the rabbis' inclusion of fowl under the biblical prohibition on eating meat and dairy together. As a consequence, Karaites and Rabbinites would not, at least in theory, have regarded one another's homes as kosher. And because Karaites rejected significant elements of the rabbinite prayer service, they formed synagogues of their own where they followed a distinctive liturgy made up almost exclusively of biblical passages. Karaite observance of the Sabbath and festivals also differed markedly from that of Rabbinites. Whereas Rabbinites permitted the use of fire kindled before the Sabbath for light, warming up food, etc., Karaites, at least initially, adopted a much more stringent position, according to which the use of fire, regardless of when it was kindled, was completely forbidden. Again, one could easily imagine the sociological impact of such differences on the two groups, since they would have essentially precluded a Karaite from visiting the home of a Rabbinite on the day of rest. Karaites also prohibited sexual intercourse on the Sabbath. Before the discovery of the Geniza, our understanding of the relations between the two groups was mediated by our knowledge, on the one hand, of ritual differences such as these, and on the other hand, by a body of ferociously hostile polemical literature exchanged by writers in both camps. The resulting picture was one of mutually felt antagonism and almost complete social segregation. The Geniza's discovery has dramatically revised this overly neat picture of social isolation resulting from theological disagreement. The more we learn about the social and economic aspects of life for medieval Jews, the more we realize how inseparably connected the two communities in fact were. The Geniza provides us with abundant evidence that joint business ventures involving Karaites and Rabbinites were commonplace. Even more impressively, we learn that Karaites were generous donors to Rabbinite religious institutions, the very embodiment of the traditions they ostensibly reviled. But the most remarkable illustration of the more accommodationist attitude that evidently prevailed on the ground is the corpus of marriage contracts for weddings between Karaite and Rabbinite partners, essentially ketubot for mixed marriages. And that is what you're looking at one example of this right now. Geniza records indicate that mixed marriages of this sort were actually quite common before the 13th century and were formally recognized in both communities. The Geniza has even preserved a page from a formulary with a heading that reads, "This is the form for a marriage in which the groom is a Rabbinite and the bride a Karaite." A special heading was warranted because contracts that were used for such unions contained a unique set of clauses designed to guarantee mutual tolerance, each party undertaking to respect the religious traditions of the other. We find, for example, the stipulation that a Rabbinite husband will not bring into his house, quote, "the fatty tail, the kidneys, or the lobe of the liver," all of which were prohibited to Karaites but permitted to Rabbinites. Other stipulations concern the observance of the Sabbath and festivals. The Rabbinite husband promises that, quote, "he will not light candles on the Sabbath evening and that there will be no fire at all in his house on the Sabbath day." He also concedes that, quote, "he will not make love to her on the Sabbath and festivals as if they were weekdays." For her part, the Karaite bride promises to observe the festivals with her husband, a pledge that presumably obliged her to occasionally celebrate holidays twice, once on their Rabbinite date and once on their Karaite date, and to observe holidays like Hanukkah that were not part of the Karaites' religious calendar at all. The ketubah, or marriage contract, that we're looking at right now is an especially interesting example of this phenomenon. This is the marriage contract of David ben Daniel and Nasia, the daughter of Moshe HaKohen, and as you can see, it's dated 1082. The groom was a Rabbinite and the bride a Karaite, and we also have examples where the affiliations are the other way around. Two things made this particular case so important. The groom's father had been the head of the Rabbinite Academy in Jerusalem, and the groom himself went on to serve as the leader of the Rabbinite community in Egypt. So we are not dealing with a religiously suspect or marginal figure here, but rather someone at the very center of Rabbinite society. David ben Daniel's marriage to Nasia thus exemplifies how porous the divide between Karaites and Rabbinites in reality was, and offers an invaluable corrective to earlier, overly schematic understandings of the way the two communities interacted, or didn't. My next example illustrates how the relatively free marketplace could facilitate not only business cooperation and fraternity among members of different religious traditions, but could even lead to romance. What we're looking at here is the draft of a deposition that was submitted to a Muslim judge. The case involved an inappropriate relationship that allegedly occurred between a Jewish girl and a Christian man. The testimony is that of a Jewish physician who had firsthand knowledge of the two parties involved. We learn from the deposition that he worked together with a Christian doctor in an apothecary, and he describes for us how people would come in and get their prescriptions written up, etc. Our witness reports that among the people visiting the shop was a young woman whom he initially took to be a Muslim, but later learned was Jewish. He noticed that her visits became quite frequent. This went on for over a month. Things became more serious, however, when she showed up one day, and after sitting with the Christian doctor for a good bit of time, invited him to ride with her to see a patient who lived far away. The doctor agreed, and after he finished his work, the two disappeared together. Unfortunately for them, although fortunately for us, they were followed by two Muslim hat makers who spied their amorous behavior and reported them to the authorities, which is why the matter ultimately required the deposition of our Jewish physician and resulted in the episode's documentation. Here, then, we have evidence that the Muslim authorities were indeed interested in limiting relationships between members of different non-Muslim communities. But at the very same time, we are afforded a precious glimpse of the love-struck who evidently persevered in conducting such illicit love affairs nonetheless. Conversion to and from Judaism was yet another realm in which different religious communities were brought into direct contact. And here too, the Geniza has supplied extensive and detailed information. The most famous conversion story is that of Johannes of Oppido, the son of an aristocratic Norman family in southern Italy who was born in the late 11th century. While his twin brother Roger went off to become a knight, Johannes was chosen to enter the priesthood. The young Johannes, however, evidently had religious doubts. When he began to study the Hebrew Bible, he was impressed by the way its traditions seemed to be preserved in Jewish practice. He circumcised himself and began to observe Jewish customs. When he learned that Andreas, the Archbishop of Bari, had moved to Egypt and there converted to Judaism, he took it as a sign that he should pursue a similar path. Johannes moved to Constantinople, where he began studying Judaism more intensively and writing pamphlets challenging Christian beliefs. He converted to Judaism in 1102, and from that point on was known as Ovadia. Traveling from Constantinople to Baghdad, Aleppo, and Tyre, before ultimately settling in Cairo, his spiritual quest brought him into direct contact with the most vital centers of Jewish culture in the East and some of its most influential leaders. We know so much about Johannes Ovadia because he wrote a fascinating autobiography detailing his life's journey. But the twin transitions from Christianity to Judaism and from Western Christendom to the Islamic East, represented by his life, are perhaps even more poignantly captured in the page you see before you. What you're looking at is the text of a Hebrew liturgical poem to which Ovadia has supplied musical notation marks. Such notation is exceptionally rare in a medieval Jewish text. In fact, this is the very earliest transcription we have of synagogue music. But what makes this text even more interesting, I think, is its hybrid nature. While the text is Jewish and of Eastern provenance, the notation marks and melody come straight out of the Gregorian chant tradition. In other words, even as he embraced a new religious identity in a new part of the world, Ovadia evidently maintained something of his earlier monastic life in Italy. What we are looking at then, in a sense, is a manifestation of the way proselytes could, in at least certain cases, function as cultural and religious mediators, facilitating the transmission of traditions and ideas across communal boundaries. Different communities also came into contact with one another's traditions at shared religious shrines, which often lay on the periphery of the more organized and carefully monitored urban settings of communal life. The famous medieval traveler Benjamin of Tudela, who wandered across the Near East in the last third of the 12th century, describes a number of pilgrimage sites in Islamic lands that were venerated by Jews, Muslims, and Christians, the most famous of these being the tomb of the biblical prophet Ezekiel in Iraq. From the Geniza, we learn about another such site located at Damu, a site on the west bank of the Nile, several miles southwest of Cairo. There, Jews maintained a shrine which they identified with the biblical Moses. While the shrine could be visited at all times of the year, there were two main pilgrimage occasions: the 7th of the Jewish month of Adar, the traditional date of Moses' birth, and the festival of Pentecost, or Shavuot, which falls in the late spring. While most of the rituals that would have been observed as part of the pilgrimage are not described in our sources, an ordinance issued by leaders of the Jewish community of Fustat at the beginning of the 11th century provides us with a rare window onto at least some of the things that took place at Damu. And this is what you are looking at now, this edict or ordinance. The ordinance was drafted in response to the perceived breakdown of religious and social norms at the pilgrimage site. As one scholar has put it, the ordinance sought to control dangerous, unregulated space. In its provisions, we have a fascinating mirror image of the bacchanalian atmosphere that prevailed at Damu. The ordinance tries to impose decorum, banning frivolity and various forms of entertainment, including gambling and chess. It also bans marionette shows, singing and dancing, and brewing beer at the shrine. The sexes are no longer to mingle either. The edict forbids men to socialize with women, sit near them, or even look at them. Especially noteworthy is a clause that seems to suggest the awareness of homosexual encounters at the pilgrimage site as well. But it is a clause that specifically forbids the Jewish pilgrim from bringing a Gentile or an apostate with him to the sanctuary that interests us at the present. For here again, we can see the way religious authorities sought to erect firm boundaries between communities, while at the same time recognizing a social reality that routinely rendered those efforts ineffective. My final example of communal interactions relates to a highly creative Jewish mystical movement in 13th and 14th century Egypt. These Jewish mystics called themselves Hasidim, no connection whatsoever to the modern movement that originated in Eastern Europe. And in calling themselves Hasidim, they revived an old biblical term. But we shouldn't let the biblical roots of their self-designation mislead us, for their mystical traditions were heavily indebted to the teachings of the Islamic Sufi tradition. These Jewish Sufis were avid readers of the classic works of Islamic Sufism. Pages from the works of Al-Khalaj, Ibn al-Arif, Al-Ghazali, and Suhrawardi were found among the Geniza manuscripts. They also produced original Sufi-inspired texts of their own. Unique devotional practices played an important role in their religious program. They wore special woolen tunics and emphasized the importance of nightly vigils, daily fasting, meditation in solitude, and abstention from sex. The pietists also tried to introduce a number of innovations into the synagogue service, including ablutions of hands and feet before prayer, frequent prostrations on the ground, and sitting on the floor in rigidly straight rows. As some of you may have realized, this sounds an awful lot like prayer in a mosque. But by no means was this a movement on the fringes of Jewish society. During the 13th century, one of its leading proponents was Abraham Maimonides, the son of Moses Maimonides and the administrative head of Egypt's Jewish community. Abraham was the author of a monumental and highly original work that sought to reinterpret biblical and rabbinic texts in line with Sufi doctrines and practices. What is perhaps most astonishing about this endeavor, though, is that Abraham was unabashed about the fact that he was imitating his Muslim contemporaries, his rationale being that the Muslims had in turn learned these practices from the prophets of ancient Israel. "You are aware," he writes, "that the customs of the ancient saints of Israel are barely found among the Jews of our day, but have become the practices of the Sufis of Islam. This is why we take over from them and emulate them." In copying the practices of the Sufis, Abraham argues, he is in fact restoring long-forgotten Jewish traditions. A captivating letter from the Geniza, which you are looking at right now, reveals the way such currents affected non-elites too. It was written by a Jewish woman whose husband, the bell-maker Basir, had become an admirer of the Islamic Sufi master al-Qurani and had taken to living with him and a group of his followers in the desert outside of town. The letter is addressed to David ben Yehoshua, the head of Egypt's Jewish community, and it beseeches him to intercede in the matter and bring Basir back to his responsibilities as a parent and a Jew. Rather than summarizing its content, I'll let the young woman speak for herself. She writes, "The maidservant, the wife of Basir the bellmaker, informs our master that she has around her neck 3 children, because her husband is infatuated with life on the mountain with Al-Qurani, a place where there is no Torah. He goes up the mountain and mingles with the mendicants. The maidservant is afraid there may be there some bad man who may induce her husband to forsake the Jewish faith. The maidservant almost perishes because of her solitude and her search after food for the little ones. It is her wish that our master go after her husband and take the matter up with him. The only thing which the maidservant wants is that her husband cease to go up the mountain. If he wishes to devote himself to God, he may do so in the synagogue, attending regularly morning, afternoon, and evening prayers, and listening to the words of the Torah, but he should not occupy himself with useless things. Once again, we see that Jews and Muslims could find themselves occupying not merely the same marketplace or public arena, but the very same religious space as well. In conclusion, what I have tried to call your attention to today is the way the documents from the Cairo Geniza significantly complicate our picture of religious communal interaction in the medieval Islamic East. Historians at one time took Islamic law codes that advocated the separation of Muslim and non-Muslim at face value, assuming that they accurately reflected what transpired in reality. The Geniza materials reveal that such sources need to be used with much greater caution. While jurists and religious scholars may have aspired to keep things separated, reality, as we have seen, rarely was in full compliance. Thank you for your attention.
As you can tell, a theme is more or less that things become more complicated, not less complicated. And two of our speakers are from Berlin, where the studies of this world began in many ways. So first we will hear from Gabriel Mitka, who is the curator in the Byzantine collection in Berlin at the Bode Museum, whom I've known for many years and who has long worked at sites in modern Turkey, in the heartland of Byzantium. And she's going to look at images in the heartland and images in the southern periphery of the Byzantine Empire, although she assures me she has reduced that to a far more specific topic. So please welcome Gabrielle.
I want to thank Helen for inviting me to read this paper, and I want to thank Elizabeth Williams, who actually read the paper, amending mistakes concerning grammar and spelling. Occasional mistakes present in my text have been added later. The symposium, Perspectives on Byzantium and Islam, focuses on the period from the 7th to the 9th century. The use of the terms heartland and southern periphery for this period need to be specified. While the Byzantine Empire reached its largest extension in the 6th century with the expansion of Islam in its provinces Egypt, Arabia, Palestine 1, 2, 3, and Syria in the southeast and south, fell under Arab rule. However, these lands, at least for a while, did not lose their mainly Christian population. The Orthodox Church and the Christian in this area continued to produce images even after the conquest, for ecclesiastical as well as for private purposes. There is plenty of evidence that Christian artisans also worked for the new Muslim rulers. This is the area which I call southern periphery. Although Arab forces attacked the coastal regions of Asia Minor on an almost regular basis, and from 674 to 678, and again in 717, even besieged Constantinople itself, the Byzantine capital and most of Asia Minor never fell permanently under Arab rule. This is the heartland, without interruption under control of the Byzantine emperor and within the authority of the Orthodox Church. In classical antiquity, the erection and maintenance of public buildings, municipal functions, and public entertainment, like circus games, often were funded by wealthy citizens who in reward gained political power and often were granted permission by the municipality to publicly set up their effigy in the form of a painted image, a bust, or a statue. The public display of munificence served to increase the donor's prestige in the eyes of his fellow citizens and to foster the competition with other wealthy and politically ambitious men. Here are two examples. Even women could do that. In the early Byzantine period, honorary statues for single men and women were still a more and more or less common practice until the 6th century. The sources, inscriptions, laws, make clear that there was a hierarchy of material used to make statues. While bronze was reserved for the imperial sphere, marble still was more precious than a painted portrait. In the tradition of this civil munificence, Byzantine churches and their decoration were often funded by donors. In contrast to earlier times, and not only in the southern provinces, groups of citizens often joined their limited financial potentials to pay for the execution of, for example, a mosaic floor. And this euergetism, as it was called, was controlled by church officials, not by imperial officers, reflecting shifting powers. So, there were donors, but there is no evidence for donor statues in churches. It would be intriguing to compare the images of donors in the Byzantine heartland with that in the southern periphery, along the shift from Byzantine to Islamic rule in the southeast. Unfortunately, the character and the date of the monuments preserved in these two regions would make such a comparison hazardous, if not impossible. While in the southern periphery, quite a number of pictorial representations of donors are preserved from the 7th and 8th centuries, there is an almost complete absence of such images in the heartland between the 6th and late 9th century, as there is a dearth of images from Constantinople and its sphere from the 7th to the middle of the 9th century anyhow. In addition, donors in the southern periphery and in the heartland come in different media. While in both areas donors are represented in churches, the southeastern donors have survived only on mosaic floors, the donors in the heartland mainly in wall mosaics, supplemented by an occasional book illustration and maybe, depending on the geographical attribution, icon. The evidence in the southeast is due to poor archaeological preservation. The walls of many churches are poorly preserved and have lost their decoration. However, we do know that donors were represented also on walls there. According to a description by Chorikios of Gaza in the 6th century, the abyssal mosaics of the church St. Sergios in Gaza showed the donor of the church, the governor of Palestine, Stephen, presented to Mary and the Christ child by St. Sergios, the church patron, in a gesture of paternal mediation. However, church floors in Constantinople were made of marble slabs, a material easily at hand from the Isle of Proconnesos, which were considered more prestigious than mosaic, not only in the Hagia Sophia, but also in the naves of St. Irene, churches A, B, and C on the university campus, and in part St. Polyeuctus. The small number of floor mosaics from the 2nd to the 7th century recorded in Constantinople up to now, the catalogue comprises 14 examples for such a big city, can neither be assigned to churches nor shows anything like a donor. Example to the left. In fact, most are merely ornamental. The situation is the same for Western Asia Minor. The corpus of mosaics in Western Asia Minor, published 3 months ago, has 144 catalog numbers, of which 30 refer to churches. Most show geometric patterns with an occasional plant or animal, example to the right. Some have donor inscriptions, but none has an image of a donor. According to this admittedly restricted evidence, donors on floors do not seem to have been an issue in the heartland. So my focus is on the donor in the imagery of Christian floor mosaics of the southern periphery. But working through the material raised doubts, and the question arose, how do we identify a donor? This question will take me to different places in the province, but in the end I will finish my journey in the Byzantine capital. As in the southern periphery, there is an unbroken continuity of imagery from the 6th to the 8th century. For this reason, I deem permissible to include evidence from this century as well. Of the roughly 200 early Byzantine churches with floor mosaics that have been documented in the provinces Syria, Palestine 1, 2, 3, and Arabia, the map with churches in modern Jordan gives an impression of the density. The majority dates back to the time before the Arab conquest, but a number of churches, we have seen in the first lecture, with dated inscriptions prove a continuing building activity well into the 8th century. Many, if not most, of the extant floor mosaics were funded by donors. As was common practice in East and West, in Italy as well as in Asia Minor or North Africa, donors perpetuated their memory and the memory of their donation through mosaic inscriptions inserted in the floor themselves. As reward for their gift, they hoped for the help of Christ and the saints, both when it came to the Last Judgment, but sometimes already in this world. Detailed versions of these inscriptions contain formulas of prayer and submission. That's an example from Rehab, of prayer and submission to God, the name of the patron saint, the names of the bishop and of local church officials who oversaw the construction work, a term for the donation, prosphora or carpophoria, the names of the donor or donors, and the date. Occasionally, the mosaic as object of the donation itself and the mosaicists are mentioned. Most of this can be missing, but the name of the donor is almost indispensable. In a number of inscriptions, the donors remain anonymous, but even then, they make reference to their names in the formula. I give the translation, whose names God knows. Obviously, the name of the donor, whether in fact mentioned or not, seems to be of distinct importance. Within the geographic region in question, only a restricted number of donors chose the image beside the inscription. Even there, it was not a general practice. The church of St. Cosmas and Damian in Jerash, ancient Gerasa, was the northernmost of a complex of 3 churches built between the years 529 and 533 in the time of Bishop Paul of Gerasa. It's the church to the left. Nave, aisles, and the intercolumnar spaces are covered with mosaic, divided in bordered carpet-like fields. A simple pattern of rosebuds covers the aisles. A complex pattern of squares of different sizes and alignments in the nave. I want to have a close look at every possible evidence for donors in this church. We only have a historic photograph of the whole, so I have to present that. There are two inscriptions. The first, in the middle of the narrow space between the nave and the sanctuary, and another one inserted in the mosaic of the nave in its easternmost portion. The first inscription is flanked by two panels. Framed by these panels can be seen here. Framed by two trees, to the right a man, dressed in long tunic and cloak, holds a burning censer far away from his body. An inscription identifies him as Theodoros Paramonarios. That's a church office. To the left, a woman, also dressed in long tunic and cloak, raises her arms in a gesture of prayer. An inscription tells us that she is Georgia Theodorou Paramonariou, that is, Georgia, the one of the Paramonarios Theodore. Although she is usually identified as Theodore's wife, she could also be his daughter, as the structure of the inscription is the same for wives as well as for sons and daughters. Both figures are isolated and framed by a frame and by trees, and at least Theodore holds an attribute that seems to fit his profession. The two share the same frontal stand and straightforward gaze. They refer to the spectator. The inscriptions in the square in the nave names the patron saints Cosmas and Damian and is an explicit donor inscription of the tribune Dagisteos, who asks God to accept his gift. Dagisteos was a high-ranked military who later fought in the wars of Justinian I. Nonetheless, his image is not present. The inscription between Theodore and Georgia indicates the patron saints Cosmas and Damian, the date, which translates to 533 AD, the reigning Bishop Paul, and at the end, in form of a play on names, points to Theodore as one who obeys to the orders of his Bishop Paul. Although the inscriptions do not explicitly reveal it, Theodore and Georgia can be identified as donors. First, there are other churches in which a narrow strip between nave and sanctuary contains more or less isolated figures, in the majority of cases oriented frontally towards the spectator and with their names inscribed alongside the figures. This is the case in St. Stephen in Erassus, in the central nave as well as in the lateral northern nave, the aisle. At the east end of the northern aisle of St. Stephen, the names of the defaced figures Abosobeos and Rabos correspond to names in inscriptions immediately to the west. Here are the figures, the inscriptions are immediately to the west, which according to their set phrase are donor inscriptions. Second, the static and frontal, almost statue-like stand distinguishes Theodore and Georgia from the vivid, active genre figures in other mosaic floors. We will see more of them. This could in fact be a faint reflex of the ancient honorary statue, conceded by Roman municipalities as common practice to benefactors who had generously contributed to the adornment or well-being of their civic community. Still in the year 608, Anno Domini, after Phocas, the emperor, gave the Pantheon in Rome to Pope Boniface IV, the Byzantine emperor was rewarded with an honorary statue on the Roman Forum. The association of donor, upright pose, and statue can also be found in the description by Procopius of Gaza from the early 6th century of an early Byzantine series of paintings in Gaza in which he praises a donor depicted on a painting. How beautiful it is to see his standing still like a statue amidst of ships. The medium of the floor mosaic could be seen as the lowest rank in the hierarchy of materials from bronze to marble to painting to floor. There remains the possibility that Theodore and Georgia were honored for other merits than a donation, as the inscription referring to Theodore does not necessarily suggest his function as donor. In the rectangular sanctuary of the Chapel of Elia, Mary, and Sorek at Jerash, the wine scrolls, which spring from a palm tree, include motifs of hunt, tame and wild animals, birds, a man carrying something heavy on his shoulder, another one in oriental costume cutting grapes. Among this vivid country life, 3 medallions, one here, one there, are filled with the figures of Mary, Sorek, and Elia, their names inscribed besides the heads, each carrying an attribute. Of the 3, only 2 have survived. Again, they stand unmoved, looking at the spectator. Their place within the floor pattern and their static frontal pose speaks in favor of the interpretation as donors. However, it is also possible that the now lost inscription, which was located in this field, was not a donor inscription, but a commemorative one rather than a dedication. In fact, the representation of donors in the sanctuary of a church is rather uncommon and casts a light doubt on the common interpretation of the 3. Apart from the donor's statue-like pose, figures engaged in various activities have been identified as donors. They have to be seen within the general repertory of floor mosaics of the region. Apart from geometric patterns, the predominant motifs are acanthus scrolls, wine scrolls, interlaced bands or intersecting lines, populated with animals, people, and occasionally objects. The themes seem rather restricted. As one might expect, scenes from the Old Testament are rare, scenes from the New Testament absent. God should not be trampled underfoot. Instead, motifs from rural life and work, trade and transport, hunting, animals of every species, and plants predominate these mosaics. Occasionally, this range of subjects is complemented by calendrical motifs and personifications of seasons, months, and the earth. In the church of St. Lot and Procopius in Kirbat al-Mukayyat, the nave is covered by wine scrolls, enclosing images of a vintage cycle, for example, cutting the grapes, transport by man or animal, pressing, various hunting motifs, for example, archer against lion, dog chasing rabbit, man with lance against lion, animals, birds, and a bearded man in the posture of a reclining shepherd. I think it should be this one. The floor contains no images of donors, although donors are mentioned in several inscriptions of the church. The motives seem to be distributed at random. The choice does not seem to follow an elaborate program. The nave of the church of the Diakon Thomas in the Ayun Musa Valley displays acanthus scrolls framed by a rich acanthus border. The motives in the scrolls are those we have seen already: collecting of fruits, archer against bear, archer against lion, cutting of grapes, transport with donkey, the reclining shepherd, wild and tame animals, and again a man fighting a lion with a lance. However, this mosaic has a distinct feature, an inscription indicating his name as Stephanos. This has led to the widely accepted assumption that, in fact, the lion fighter Stephanos is another donor. Except for the name of the Diakon Thomas, underneath a heraldic eagle in the south aisle, no other mosaic inscription exists. The motive of the lion fight is not an individual invention for Stephanos. It is a common motive in ornamental borders and central panels. Here are examples from the Chapel of St. Theodore west of the Cathedral of Madaba, and in the Baptistery of Mount Nebo. No names are given to them, and no one has ever considered them to be donors. Previously, I have stressed the importance of the donor's name. So, does a personal name like Stephanos indicate that he was a donor? Not necessarily. A mosaic in a southeastern side room of Church A at Deir es-Leib is divided in 9 squares, 4 of which show personifications of the seasons. In the lower angles, a bull and a lion rear up. In the upper angles, 2 horses appear with their names written above their back: Agatopheron and Nike, the one that brings good, and victory, typical names of racing horses. In this case, albeit the names, the idea of a donor would be absurd. The combination of animal and name has been traced back to ancient pattern books with a common corpus of iconographical types and often provided with inscriptions. In particular, horses with names are popular in representations of the circus sphere. The concept that name inscriptions alongside animals are supposed to have been based on pattern books, while name inscriptions beside persons indicate an unidentifiable person, seems arguable to me, at least in cases like the one of Stephanos, where the motive of the lion fighter is widespread and no other evidence exists for the interpretation as donor. In the Roman mosaic of Megarius from Smirat in Tunisia, a fighter named Spitara, lower left, fights not against the lion, but comparable against the leopard named Victor. Stephanos, that is wreath or crown, in my opinion, would make a fine name for a lion fighter in the arena. So, this means that the presence of an individual's name doesn't necessarily indicate that he or she was a donor. But can somebody be a donor without a name? In the upper pavement of the Chapel of Priest John in Kirbat al-Mukayyad, scrolls again enclose figures from the sphere of hunting animals, 2 men offering baskets full of fruits to a representation of the earth, a veiled woman with a basket. There are several donor inscriptions, but no figure in the scrolls qualifies as such. A male and a female bust in the ornament frame, one here and one there, repeatedly have been identified as donors. They are located in the middle of the north and east sides of the framing border. As a symmetrical disposition seems likely, it is likely that a third and fourth bust were once inserted in the damaged southern and western part of the frame. The man wears a tunic and a cloak. His voluminous gray hair retreats on both sides. He has a full brown beard. The woman wears a tunic and a cloak with a jeweled brooch, a golden diadem in her long open hair, a necklace and pearl earrings. A grayish nimbus surrounds her head. The man's haircut often was taken for a tonsure, his hair considered a nimbus too, which from the shape and in comparison of the two busts to me seems quite impossible. There are two inscriptions with names in this church. One refers to Bishop John and Priest John, both not qualified as donors by the formulas. The other inscription refers to 5 donors: Sergius, son of Stephanos, Procopius, son of Porphyria, Romi, Mary, and Julian. As there are more names than busts, the busts were variously attributed different names from both inscriptions. 2 elements in the female bust seems to argue against the identification with an actual woman. Respectable women did not wear their hair loose, and living women were not awarded with a nimbus. The framing border of mosaic fields often contains personifications of different kind. Although the position of the two busts does not correspond to the ordinary position of personifications, in the female bust I'd rather see a reflex of a personification than the representation of a real person. And as an example, I give the personification of Soteria from the bath of Apollousis near Antioch. She doesn't have a halo. We have other personifications with a halo, but she has the hair open and she is embellished with jewelry. But there are several other personifications that could be compared. So, what is lacking in both images is an inscription giving the name. Therefore, for the iconography as well as for the lack of an image, of an inscription with a name, I'm convinced that the female bust does not refer to a real person, and I doubt whether the male bust does either. I'm sorry if my remarks tend more to cast doubts on identifications of donors on church floors than to explore donors belonging to social or gender groups, to analyze whether the imagery represents a specific view of the world, or to ask whether representations are realistic or typical, questions that have been discussed and stimulated in recent books and articles. I hope I was able to present reasons, first to look closely whether a figure means a church official, a donor, a deceased, or somebody else. Only then, valid conclusions can be drawn from the evidence. I promised to finish my journey in Constantinople, a short stop. In the Hagia Sophia, another potential donor is lacking a name. The mosaic over the central imperial door leading from the narthex into the nave is considered to be a donor's image by most scholars. A Byzantine emperor is kneeling at Christ's feet and opens his arms in a gesture of prayer. A first anomaly consists in the absence of a gift. While other emperors present deeds or models of churches, this emperor's hands are empty. The other uncommon feature is the absence of the name. This lack offered scholars the opportunity to argue at length in favor of an identification either as Basil I, 886 to 912, or as his son Leo VI, 867 to 886. Sorry, I mixed up it's the other way around with the dates. So, they argued at length on the base of various historical and stylistical arguments. But why would any of these emperors have renounced naming his name when giving a donation? Tsaga Gavrilovich and Alexei Lidov, almost followed by Leslie Brubaker, tried to solve this difficulty by interpreting the mosaic as an image of pan-imperial supplication for well-being of the capital city. That is, as an ideal, not a real, Byzantine emperor. I don't know about another ideal image of the Byzantine emperor like this, but if their theory can be strengthened, another donor's image emerges as something else. Thank you.
We have two last talks. One is going to be looking at Byzantium from the periphery that is to us the center, that is Rome. And then we're going to end with a talk on Mashhata, which is in a way the Umayyad response to the mosaics we've been seeing so far today. The first of the talks is by Annie Labatt, who has just defended her dissertation related to this topic at Yale University and has been involved with the museum in various ways for several years. She is the person organizing the blog on the exhibition with Betsy Williams. So if you're interested in any of these issues, do go to the website and look at it. And let's welcome Annie Labatt.
Hi. Okay. Iconography, or the art historical study of shapes and forms, is often dismissed as an assemblage of lists, caricatured as a series of inventories of forms and subject matters. So much so that a distinguished scholar at Yale recently told me, "I didn't think that iconography could say anything meaningful." So it can. Reading iconographies, moving beyond taxonomies, we can apprehend significant variations between objects with the same narrative subject matter. Shifting and mobile iconographies provided a pan-Mediterranean common language and a fertile means of cultural exchange. Beginning with one object, the Fieschi Morgan reliquary, we will inevitably be led to other objects that participate in the common language of its imageries. The Fieschi Morgan reliquary actually made the Wall Street Journal, but the readers only got a glimpse of the reliquary, the early 9th century casket from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. What the Wall Street Journal readers could see was the enameled representation of the crucifixion. What they couldn't see was that the crucifixion doubles as a removable lid. It slides, and it comes off. And it is an object well-suited to John of Damascus' insistence that our cognition is grounded in the work of all of our senses. Writing in the 7th to 8th centuries, John emphasizes the senses as the means by which the soul apprehends and discriminates material objects. Sight registers color and movement. He says, quote, "Now sight is primarily perception of color, but along with color, it discriminates the body that has color, and its size and form and locality, and the intervening space and the number, also whether it is in motion or at rest, end quote. But sight cannot operate alone because, as John says, it is only possible in straight lines, whereas we need multiple kinds of perception, such as, quote, heat and cold, softness and hardness, viscosity and brittleness, heaviness and lightness, up and down. John's emphasis on movement, motion or rest, up and down, seems perfectly suited to a reading of the decorations on the Fieschi Morgan reliquary. The enameled exterior reliquary shows the body of Christ melding with the cross. The earthy brown at the base of the cross, where Christ's feet rest, becomes a bright blue above, both behind Christ's arms and above his head in the form of the titulus. Through the presence of Christ's body, the cross takes on an ethereal quality. Base wood becomes, via the body of Christ, spiritualized. The vertical progression, encouraged by the coloristic shift, enhanced by the central saint on the bottom register, who wears the same shade of brown as the foot pedestal, and the saint above wearing the titulus shade of blue, draws the eye of the viewer along an axis that culminates in a latch. The vertical axis elongates as the box opens, thereby further emphasizing the form of Christ's body, while the interior shows the partitions in the shape of the cross and the actual artifact of the Holy Cross. Sliding the lid and flipping it over, the engaged viewer literally opens a conversation about Christ and his duality. Turning over the lid activates a major shift, one that switches from blues, greens, and browns to impressionistic grooves and incisions. In essence, when the lid is turned over, the grooved metal border on the exterior becomes the new medium, since the representations of the Annunciation, the Nativity, the Crucifixion, and the Anastasis, or the harrowing of hell, are all in the same black metallic material. Initiating the Christological narrative is a quote from Luke, "Hail, full of grace," which both proclaims the arrival of the Christ child and also calls us to attention. The following quadrant labels the scene as the Nativity, as though responding simply and directly to the previous episode. The pronouncement has been fulfilled. The crucifixion, like the Annunciation, turns to Scripture. Along the left side of Christ's body, the Greek inscription visualizes the words of the Virgin, "Here is your son," while on the right side is an inscription giving form to John the Baptist's words, "Here is your mother." These phrases replicate the inscriptions that appear on the front of the lid, but this time without also identifying Mary and John. On the enameled exterior, inscriptions fill the background. They are everywhere. But on the inside of the lid, these inscriptions become simpler and shorter until finally, in the Anastasis scene, they disappear altogether. It is almost as though the final quadrant is visualizing John of Damascus' observation that, quote, "images and sermons might serve the same purpose," end quote. Or the 9th century patriarch Nicephorus' argument that, quote, "through calligraphic genius, the teachings of a divine history appear to us. By the excellence of painting, those same things are shown to us," end quote. Or the patriarch Photios' assertion that sight could supersede text. Quote, "Martyrs have suffered, and their memory is contained in books. These deeds they are also seen performing in pictures, and painting presents the martyrdom of those blessed men more vividly to our knowledge. These things are conveyed both by stories and by pictures, but it is the spectators rather than the hearers who are drawn to emulation," end quote. It is striking that the silent scene makes the most final and resonant statement in the series of Christological episodes. The message of the Anastasis, that of salvation and general resurrection, highlights the relationship of the reliquary to the end of days, when all relics and all bodies will be reassembled and made whole. The anastasis scene also underscores the dual natures of Christ. He is both dead and alive, human and divine, and he is in an undefined position in terms of time and geography. He crushes the basilisk under his weight and pulls Adam's arm with strength and vigor. But he is imbued with a sense of weightlessness as shown by his fluttering cloak. The broken gates of Hades, which float in the upper right-hand corner of the anastasis quadrant, also suggest a strange defiance of gravity. These hovering gates also draw attention to the role of doors and doorways. The gates continue the direction of a strong diagonal created by the body of Christ, which runs from his right foot along his right thigh, emphasized by peculiarly deep angled hatch marks, through the slanted angle of his nimbus. The pattern created by the rectangular doors mirrors the shape and angle of the cross in Christ's nimbus. The shape also responds to the basin above, in which the Christ child is being bathed. The T-shaped basin in the nativity scene has been flipped over and repeated as the broken gates below, as if to illustrate the intricate link between birth and resurrection. The language of doors and doorways takes on a further dimension of meaning by virtue of the fact that this is a physical door, and the onlooker must engage with it in a physical way. By removing the lid and reading the scenes, the viewer enacts many of the same gestures as Christ. The viewer opens a door, like Christ does in the anastasis. In fact, you might say the viewer makes the exact gesture of flipping over the doors as the artist did when he turned the basin into the gates. Just as Christ shifts between the earthly and the otherworldly, the viewer participates in a transitioning between two worlds, from variegated and richly hued to achromatic, from literal to abstract, from exterior and overt to interior and hidden, from many voices and words and names to silence. Perhaps the anastasis does not need a label because Christ's descent is beyond comprehension, beyond the capacity of words. Or perhaps the anastasis is doing precisely what John of Damascus, Nikephoros, and Photios were saying could happen, that the image could serve as faithfully as words. Iconographical forms could, in fact, act as a type of vocabulary. The forms and shapes, the very words used by John of Damascus, that created an anastasis, communicated an episode that any devout viewer would recognize. The fact is that these iconographies were shared. They represented a common language, one that was cross-cultural and pan-Mediterranean. The art of the medieval world is built on imageries that were repeated, a repetition with variations that extends across remarkable physical distances. In reading the internal dynamics of an object like the Fieschi Morgan reliquary, we are led to comparisons with other expressions of that same common language. And when we are making such comparisons, we are recreating, in our own time, the pan-Mediterranean language and the dialogue of images that at some level always operated in the early Christian centuries. Doors, movement, liminality, the themes suggested by a multidimensional reading of the Fieschi Morgan anastasis, also inform an anastasis that appears in the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua in the Roman Forum. And this painting shows, I think I have a pointer. So here's Christ, and here's his mandorla, and he's grabbing at Adam's hand, who's here, and there's Eve waiting as well, and there's the basilisk, and then there's the sarcophagus. This image, dated to 705, decorates a large panel on a ramp leading from the church to the summit of the Palatine Hill, connecting the holy space of the church with the political space of the palaces above. Its placement near a doorway is significant because it is the first and last thing the viewer would see in the church. This anastasis is liminal in a literal sense. It is actually on the threshold between two spaces and two worlds. One might think that the sense of movement and transition would be limited on a flat wall, but this is not so. Even when standing in front of the painting, there is a sense of uncertainty and instability because the viewing experience is awkward. The viewer is on an incline in a small space and standing so close to the painting that it takes a moment to register the entirety of the composition. It's also very dark, so my photographs never ever came through, so I'm using this aqua tint made by Joseph Wilpert from 1916, and I did that to help you see all the lines and angles. The sense of gravity as the visitor moves along the image, down the incline of the ramp, gives the painted sarcophagus almost a sense of physical reality and purpose. The visitor is stepping down next to what looks like a painted stair. By the same token, when exiting the church, the viewer is moving upwards, as though he, like Adam and Eve, is being saved. Diagonals are important, as is evident from my many lines. They are meant to reference, include, and counterbalance the incline of the slope. The connection between the painting's diagonals and the physical slope of the ramp engages the viewer in such a way that he becomes a participant in the painting and, by extension, the moment of salvation that it is representing. In his writing, John of Damascus insists on the importance of memory as a storehouse of information that facilitates perception. Images, he asserts, are essential in creating memories and reminding us of past deeds. As its own alpha and omega, as the first and last thing witnessed by the churchgoer, the painting marks the memory of the viewer with the image of resurrection. Again, as in the Fieschi Morgan Reliquary, there is dynamic movement and involvement and activity by the viewer. The anastasis message, therefore, resonates on multiple levels, both as a celebration of general salvation of mankind and as a specific message directed towards the individual witnessing the image. The implication of the individual takes on a central role in another later 9th century painting of the anastasis. At San Clemente, in a recessed space removed from the more trafficked areas of the church, is a lunette showing, again, the scene of Christ stepping on the basilisk and pulling Adam and Eve from their tombs. And you can see Eve, you can see just her little hands, just the fingertips, so go Eve. This anastasis, however, includes the portrait of St. Cyril, the famous missionary who converted the Slavic peoples to Christianity and after whom the Cyrillic alphabet is named. In 868, Cyril and his brother Methodios had been summoned from Thessaloniki to Rome by Pope Nicholas in order to publicize and defend their translation of the liturgy into Slavonic. Accompanied by the relics of St. Clement, which they deposited beneath the high altar at the church of the same name, the brothers helped the new Pope Hadrian II spread their translation of the liturgy. Cyril died 2 months after arriving in Rome, and it is most likely that the tomb under the painting of the anastasis was in fact Cyril's. As with the sliding lid of the Fieschi Morgan Reliquary and the sloping painting at Santa Maria Antiqua, doors and portals frame the discussion of the image. Here, Cyril stands in what appears to be a doorway. Perhaps it is an entry to his tomb. Perhaps it is a path to paradise. The painting provides details that emphasize the specificity of Cyril's appearance. Cyril's face is long and drawn, a feature further emphasized by his dark brown beard and the shape of his handlebar mustache. His eyes are heavily lined, and his forehead is creased with wrinkles, perhaps the result of age, but I personally think it has to do with translating all those texts, because that's a lot of more homework. His eyebrows are thick and dark and arch in a way that suggests an expression of penitence or surprise. His nose is also particularized, composed of a long, thin shaft ending in two bulb-like shapes on either end. The most specific expression of individuality is Cyril's headdress, the white head covering decorated with red decorative patterns. Prototypes for headgear of this sort do not exist in Rome. Images of monastic figures do appear in Rome, in churches like San Crisogono, that's shown here, San Armete, San Sebastiano al Palatino, San Saba, but these hoods are pointed and dark. The 13th century paintings of the standing monastic saints at St. Anthony's Monastery in Egypt are a better visual source for parsing the head covering. This portrait of Peshoy the Great shows the monk wearing a white head covering with black and white designs that are similar to Cyril's. This image is admittedly later than the Cyril portrait, but it documents, as nothing else in Rome does, the practice of wearing this type of headgear. The suggestion is that Cyril was being distinguished so as to indicate his role as representative of a monastic community and one with ties to the Holy Land. When studying the painting of Cyril, it is hard not to think about the 7th century portrait of the 4th century monastic figure, Abbot Shenouta, at the Red Monastery in Sohag. Shenouta's facial features correspond with the Roman fresco. Both monastics appear framed in a way that highlights their role as iconic figures and harks back to the bust-length figures surrounding the exterior of the Fieschi Morgan reliquary. Another representation of an Eastern monk, monastic figure that resonates visually with these portraits is that of Simeon Stylites at San Felice in Cimitile, Italy, painted in the 9th century. Simeon was one of the famous holy men known as Stylites that expressed their devotion by living on the top of a pillar. It is not easy to know exactly which Simeon is being represented, the elder who lived from 389 to 459, or the younger who lived from 521 to 562. But this distinction does not seem to be too significant. Both lived on columns, both were the source of widespread veneration as holy men, and both were represented in similar ways. The Cimitile Simeon wears a pointed dark hood, much like the monks in the 9th century paintings in Rome. But despite the differences in headgear, Shenouta, Cyril, and Simeon share a number of formal features: the deep-set eyes, thickly arching eyebrows, pointed beard, the weighty, sloping shoulders, the thick painted frame, and the bust-length format. They share a visual vocabulary, one that speaks a language of monastic holiness and the Holy Land. In addition to facial similarities, Cyril and Simeon relate to their surroundings in similarly transitional ways. In both cases, columns play a central role in this transition. The column to the right of Cyril simultaneously sets off and ties the saint to the events of the anastasis. The column demarcates the line between two zones, yet its blue and white grooves are exactly like the tightly set folds of both Adam and Christ's undergarments. See, so those shapes are very much like these here. In fact, Christ's fluttering cloak cuts right through the middle of the column, thereby introducing a number of cross-columnar similarities. For example, the stars on Cyril's blue cloak match those decorating the concentric frames in the mandorla surrounding Christ. So you can see those same shapes up here in the mandorla here, these snowflake shapes. Simeon's portrait is also set next to an anastasis. Here, too, there are ways in which the saint is set off from that scene. Simeon occupies a small section that is not visible when looking directly at the wall with the crucifixion and the anastasis. Though tucked in the corner, he nevertheless plays an important transitional role, linking the crucifixion to the anastasis. In a way, Simeon is like the bust-length saints on the Fieschi Morgan reliquary, who frame the crucifixion and stand guard even when the lid has been opened to reveal the anastasis. Here, Simeon leads the viewer from the crucifixion to the representation of the anastasis. By looking to the left, the saint, and this is hard to see, but he's He's looking to the left, and this is the anastasis here. You can see the mandala, which is right there. So, and I'm pointing at the column that he's standing on and how this links with these figures that are waiting in the tomb. By looking to the left, the saint draws attention to the crucifixion. Meanwhile, the famous column upon which he spent his life in the wilderness links directly to the wrappings of the patient sinners who wait for salvation in the anastasis scene. Both the wrappings and the pinnacle of the column are composed of tightly conjoined and longitudinal ovals. These same shapes also appear on Christ's cloak under his right arm and around his left hand. The central feature of Simeon's veneration in iconography, the column, as on the walls at Cimitile, is another example of universal cross-cultural language. Not all representations of Simeon from the period suggest mobility. On the large relief from Berlin, represents the stylite almost as though he has become one with the column, an inflexibility and petrification encouraged by the material of its making, a thick, heavy basalt. The actual existence of columns associated with major stylites, such as both the older and younger stylites, was celebrated and reified by the building of major complexes, such as the pilgrimage site of Kalat Zaman, built in 470 in honor of Simeon the Younger's column, and the Wondrous Mountain, completed between 541 and 551 in honor of the elder. Nevertheless, as Brandy Ratliff discusses in the catalog for the exhibition, the pilgrims visiting these sites and venerating the bodies of the stylites were also returning with a number of objects that commemorated their travels. Easily portable tokens and jugs bearing stylite iconography made their way from these Syrian sites to places throughout the Mediterranean. Ratliff writes about pilgrims from Syria, Cilicia, Armenia, Asia Minor, and the Persian frontier. Italy was clearly in the mix as well. Bodies of saints and bodies of shapes acted as conduits of meaning, as part of an exchange that does not conform to the traditional static East versus West model. It is important to approach the art from the 7th to the 9th centuries with an eye towards a sense of fluid exchange, both internally, where the images relate to each other within the space of the object, and externally, across the Mediterranean. Images and shared iconographies reveal points of contact between communities and territories that were seemingly far from each other, both geographically and culturally. For example, the standing figure of David from the Syriac translation of the Book of Kings is an almost exact replica of the pose of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, as depicted on the 6th century walls of San Vitale in Ravenna. Exchanging Justinian's ceremonial bowl for David's lyre, so here's the bowl, and there's the lyre, and turning the tablion, which is here, into a golden codex there, the 7th century Syriac manuscript painter nonetheless borrowed the pose, dress, and coloration of the 6th century Italian mosaic. By taking Justinian's form and using it for David, the artist emphasized the imperial authority of the biblical king, putting David's power in the context of imperial iconography. The same representation of David, red shoes, purplish cloak, halo, and pose, appears in the upper right-hand corner of the 6th century Rabula Gospels, although he does not wear the bejeweled crown and he holds his right hand in benediction. And by the way, below the Rabula David, in the depiction of the Nativity, Mary holds her arms in a dramatically crossed pose, a position that scholars have noted as being unusual, suggesting that it might be a unique regionalism. Yet the same crossed arm pose reflects not only the stance of John the Baptist across the page, but also that of Mary in the Nativity on the lid of the Fieschi Morgan reliquary, which in turn mimics the crossed arms of Christ in the anastasis below and the anastasis at Cimitile. Perhaps it is not so rare after all. It is really remarkable how far these connections can be seen to carry. Like the anastasis, the Maria Regina iconography appeared many times during the 7th to 9th centuries in Rome, and this iconography as such really appears nowhere else. This iconography highlighted Christ as wholly human, as a child, and simultaneously the future King of Heaven. From the humble mother of Christ to the regal Madonna with hanging pearls was a significant and rather dramatic leap. The visual similarity between the Maria Regina crown and that worn by Theodora at Ravenna is an obvious connection. But the pearls go much further afield. They draw on associations with paradise and the end of time, associations found by Barry Flood in the pearls decorating the 8th century Great Mosque of Damascus. Another iconography that had a life in early medieval Rome, that of the Transfiguration, has clear visual associations with the apse at Sinai, patronized by the same Emperor Justinian. The Roman artists took the 6th century composition that was in the belly of the apse and moved it directly over the altar at Santi Nedeo ed Achilleo in the 9th century, asserting a connection between the metamorphosis of Christ at the moment of his transfiguration and the celebration of the Eucharist, which would have occurred directly below the triumphal arch. Thus, large-scale mosaics and painted church walls, immobile monuments, paradoxically enough, are participants in a fluid iconographical conversation. Like Simeon's column, that which is static acts as a participant in a discourse that is quite the opposite. Following the interrelationships between iconographies naturally allows us to draw Roman churches into a conversation with a monastery in Egypt, to bring a Syriac manuscript into a discussion with 6th century Ravenna, all the while considering the images on the lid of the Fieschi-Morgan reliquary. If iconography is just about inventorying forms and shapes, it is not a powerful tool. Furthermore, the work of art is more important than the nationality of the artist. The catalog for the exhibition shows the Fieschi-Morgan reliquary as having come from Constantinople with a question mark. It is actually well served by that question mark. Whether the reliquary came from Constantinople or Syria or Rome is not really the most important aspect of this object. This approach would be like seeing John of Damascus only in terms of his birthplace, especially when his work appeared in many languages. He was known by many names, and he had a following throughout the Mediterranean. Byzantium and Islam steps away from traditional scholarly classifications and preconceived assumptions about a Christian world divided into East and West. In the exhibition, the Fieschi-Morgan reliquary is not a closed casket. Open, it calls attention to its own dynamic movement and to the viewer's active and physical engagement with the object, but also to its Christological resonances with iconographies that were the common language of its time. Let us think of it as opening us up to a world, literally the entire Mediterranean world, a world of many correspondences. Thank you.
Our talks have been from Byzantium, but we're going to close with a very powerful answer to that from Dr. Klaus-Peter Haus-Long, the director of the Islamic Museum in Berlin, which, like the Byzantine Museum that Gabriel Mitka is at, are sources of the beginning of the studies of our concepts in the Western world of both Byzantium and Islam and what they were and how they interact. And one of the aspects of the Islamic Museum since the beginning of the 20th century has been the great palace at Mashhad, outside actually at the airport in Amman, Jordan, near many of the mosaics that Professor Schick has shown and that Gabrielle Mitka herself talked about. So let us welcome Professor Haus.
Thank you very much indeed. I admire you that you are still alive after a long afternoon of intensive researches. First, my sincere thanks to Helen Evans for the invitation and for her staff to really bring me here into a venerable place. And my congratulations also to the timing of the exhibition. I think when you started considering it, you had not dreamt of a rebellion taking place in many countries of the Near East, and perhaps you may even have given some incentive to these happenings. The social life, after the many talks, and especially the last talk, the social life in the Islamic countries may sound to you as rather comfortable, and one should look more and more, this is for decades what I also taught, one should look more and more into the integration of the communities in the Near East and otherwhere. But if you look into the last news, this seems to be somehow in a difficult development at the moment. The historical setting may have been rather comfortable for many, but it seems that this is seriously endangered now. Looking back into history, I don't want to spit into the soup of integration, which is always necessary to be cooked, but I fear that my contribution will be in a way rather speculative, but asking for caution in interpreting iconologies, where we don't have any texts of iconography really telling us this is by inscription Theodoros and this is the donor lady so-and-so. If we don't have these texts, our speculations, of course, run into the ways where we know what we are seeing, a vine and something like that. But is it really what we are seeing? This is somehow questionable if one sees the context. Our question is how the contacts, especially between former politically leading circles of Christians under Byzantine rule, with the new Islamic authorities and with the Caliph, for example, had looked like in the early Islamic period. And I want to discuss how one could expect the early Islamic authorities to have made use of propaganda means for attracting the Christian population in the arts, for example, or whether we need to look for a sheer Islamic self-representation and its attraction for the other communities in itself. The change from the Byzantine era in the Near East to Islamic rule meant an epochal shift in every respect, in political, social, spiritual, and also economical life, which must have taken place in rather quick steps. Everyday life continued, as we have seen with many examples from the churches, the monasteries, dated into the Islamic period of Syria, Jordan, and the Fertile Crescent. And archaeologists have an awful time to differentiate between Byzantine and Umayyad levels. Harold Mayer, a wonderful archaeologist, used to talk of Byzum ceramics, Byzantine Umayyad ceramics. This is a fabulous and very helpful term. The first decades after this rush Arab conquest brought a mixed administration for the intelligentsia and the real ones. And this was situated between the ruling class of the Medinan and Meccan aristocracy and the local sedentary population, as well as with the Arab tribal society. It consisted of Greek as well as Arabic-speaking and writing administrators, secretaries they are called mostly, and also, for example, the mint officials who promoted Byzantine gold mint design with figures of the Greek emperors like Heraclius and his heirs, and later of the figures of the caliphs in the same attitude, or in Iran with the Sasanian silver coins, in the old Sasanian motives with additional Arabic inscriptions. There were many Arab monophysite Christians in the service of caliphs. Johannes Chrysostomus, who was just named by one of his names, and you mentioned that he had several others, may have been one of the, not to say secretaries, but of the near entourage of the caliph of his period. And also scholars with training in Christian theology and classical studies have surely somehow fostered the beginning and development of Islamic dogma and of the Islamic new value system, which was formulated and defined in opposition to the former theology. A marked shift happened in the reign of the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik around 692 to 695, when the Caliphate administration, the tax registration, and several other things were changed completely from Greek and Arabic into pure, wholly Arabic. And when a mint reform brought about the shape of purely Arabic coins and dirhams and dinars, in the shape with inscriptions only we know for several centuries then. We believe that these events have until now not been taken seriously enough for the interpretation of the architectural forms in early Islamic art. A certain range of important early Islamic monuments in the region of the Fertile Crescent have in art history been labeled as Byzantine forms under Arabic caliphal patronage. Most famous, the Dome of the Rock, which in the Middle Ages served as, among other, the form or the model of the Temple of Salomon as a church in the Crusader kingdom, and in early Renaissance art history as a curious monument. In early art as a curious monument, and in early art history as a monument built by Byzantine craftsmen with allusion to victory monuments and mausolea of the Byzantine era. It served, of course, as a proof for the incapability of Arabs in building and designing important monuments for their new religion of their own, except in the decrepit, imperfect cube of the Kaaba. But this would not be really in line with the invention of new architectural forms like the mosque and other architecture erected in the Fertile Crescent region. One observation is necessary. There was in the Byzantine province of Syria and Palestine not really spectacular imperial architecture, perhaps except for the pilgrim center of Qalat Sim'an, a Justinianian foundation, and for the famous cathedral of Antiochia, which was in ruins at that period already, and some minor copies of it. A real monumental imperial Byzantine architecture did not exist until the Islamic conquest, and it was the new rule which enabled our great architecture in the region. We'll come back to that. A fresh wind of interpretation of the art history came with the studies of, for example, Robert Schick on the Christian culture under Islamic rule, and recently by Garth Foden, who has collected the material evidence for Hellenistic, Christian, and other pre-Islamic traditions and instigations under and with the Umayyads. Foden's formulation, especially with respect to the images and stucco sculptures, which were studied and became more known from Umayyad representations, for example, the paintings of the caliphs in Qusay Amra and Qasr al-Khair al-Gharbi palaces. His interpretation is that the obvious allusions of the depictions of a ruler to Sasanian as well as Byzantine ceremonial must have been chosen in order to address the old population, not only the Muslim Arabs, but perhaps the newly converted or those who should become converted, and to make the new culture somehow attractive for them. This is a very interesting formulation which will be of help for the interpretation or our look at the Meshatta facade. I would like to emphasize the slight reserve that the impetus of the new system dwindles away the more we interpret old interpretations of the Christian pre-Islamic traditions into the motives, and the enormous strength in the development and the formulation of the new Islamic religious and secular values would be somehow shaded or would remain hidden behind the forces of the older traditions. Therefore, at the end, I will present you with a speculation, and this is a fine organization of Helen's that she poses this paper in diagonal to Robert Schick's presentation, who was very careful to avoid speculations. I will, at my age, I'm allowed to dare and speculate. So I would formulate that I see the Umayyad period as an epoch of experiments in several fields and also in the representative arts, a synthesis from old traditions and very quick new solutions. New buildings, new architectural features in mosques were partly covered by ornaments in traditional techniques and motives, like here in the Dome of the Rock with the fabulous mosaic plates coming, of course, as spolia from other buildings, but rearranged in a wonderful fashion and with additions which apparently have been carved new for the occasion. I will not speculate on the vine and the pearls. We have heard about that. Avinoam Shalem has done a fabulous study on the Yatima pearl, Barry Flood on the wine scroll in the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. But I would like to dwell on the motive of or the signum, I would say, of the arcades, which could help us to follow a possible scheme of reinterpretation and re-evaluation of messages. These are frames. You see the little arcades as framing certain motives, and the representative structure of a field of programmatic importance framed by a Hellenistic architectural feature will reappear throughout the early Islamic period. And you have a wonderful example here in the new Islamic presentation in the wooden plate there. This sort of architecture was, of course, well, this is coming in between. It's the same mosaic which we have just seen a few minutes ago from the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, representing architecture of apparently buildings, villages, or cities, and water flowing, which, of course, remains until now rather enigmatic if you don't believe the interpretation as a paradisical locus amoenos. The arcades are, like in the San Apollinare Nuovo church, the representative structure and perhaps a pars pro toto of palace architecture. This is already in late antiquity as a structural form, slightly variated always. But the main thing, even with an inscription denominating it as a palace, shows the architecture with curtains as a signum, as the imperial palace, and situated in the church under a sort of arcades with holy figures of the prophets and the patriarchs in this church. Already in late antiquity, these forms tended to be used and variated like in this famous sarcophagus from Old St. Peter with the dispersion of the law, represented by Christ giving the law in a roll, and the attendants being shown in front of a great architectural background. Variations show the arcades in form of trees, like in this sarcophagus from Arles, with several scenes from Old and New Testament here, with Susanna and the elders apparently right of the central motive, and in another famous casket in the British Museum from the treasure of the Equilinus, where even the change of arcades with pointed structures is used in order to variate the enclosed forms. More famous has become a rather recent find of a curtain. This is monumental, 2 meters high, and I don't know how many meters long, in the Abeck Foundation, reconstructed from bad fragments and showing Bacchus, a late antique representation in the central arch with, it's the naked figure here, sorry, with other representations leading towards the central figure. These arcades, as I want to emphasize, seem also to concentrate on certain parts of larger exposure, in the larger feature, architectural feature, or the representation, for example, in only diptychal form in 2 niches represented on ivories, like here on apparently part of a diptychon with the Archangel Michael. You can imagine what I want to somehow introduce to you, and this is the notion, of course, of the Bashata facade, which will appear in short again. For the many examples of this early Islamic palace architecture in the region, it has always been formulated in the earlier art history that the main ideas were somehow taken from Byzantine or late antique models, and that the ornamental additions appeared as a rather crude or unpretentious stylization of antique motifs. Even in this afternoon, I sometimes heard the formulation, like by Gabriele Mietke, that the representations within the frames are rather haphazard. The frames she mentioned were the frames by a vine scroll, for example, with several depictions of ordinary life scenes, agricultural scenes, hunt, and other scenes. Do we know what and why they were represented? I wonder. I would tend to the idea that we will have to wait for a certain time until inspiration comes to art history, how to look at it perhaps again. This wonderful wooden representation is only one arcade in the center, and that should somehow lead to the idea that the sides are leading your eyes or the beholder towards this center. And of course we have to dwell a minute on the famous find of the Islamic Geniza from Sana'a, the treasure of several 10,000s of Quran fragments in the old mosque of Sana'a 40 years ago, among which was found this extraordinary frontispiece of a Quran of apparently the Umayyad period, showing niches like the galleries of a mosque around perhaps what is a courtyard with perhaps what looks like some sort of minaret, which didn't exist at that period as far as we know, and a doorway. So the niches are being filled with flowers and some other vegetal motifs only. Now, for architecture in the Umayyad period, famous is the main hall or the introductory hall to the Umayyad palace in Amman citadel, which has recently become a wooden dome, maybe with a good reason, maybe not, but showing arcades in small form and in the larger form, with an arcade cutting out a vegetal ornament from a virtual repetition into this one tree for each large arcade. And now I think you are prepared to look at the Mashhad facade, somehow slightly manipulated by my presentation, which might help us in seeing this as an intentional architecture. First, some dates, of course. The facade is 47 meters long. It is set into the facade between two half towers, two of the half towers encircling the whole architecture, namely here. And it used to be there until 1903, when the famous friendship between Turks and Germans brought about that a little present was given by Sultan Abdul Hamid to his friend Wilhelm in shape of the Mashhad facade. And the German archaeologists and historians who were interested in it looked at especially the left part of the facade and detected the right part. This looks all the same, so they took only half of it. The rest of that right facade, unfortunately, got lost. And still, what arrived in Berlin in 1903 in 449 blocks was immediately studied by several art historians, and it took 10 years to define that this should be labeled as Islamic and put into the early Umayyad period, into the Umayyad period at the end of the Umayyad period. Many famous names, Ernst Herzfeld and Karl-Heinrich Becker, the later cultural minister of Prussia, were involved. Then came the interpretations of Richard Hamilton on the probable patron of Mashhad, who was found out that most probably the second Caliph Al-Walid ibn Yazid, should be the patron of this extraordinary building, because he was famous as a poet, and Richard Hamilton, in a fine study on Al-Walid and his friends, you can imagine this is not work on politics, but more on bacchanal stories we have heard about already today, the allusions to Christian girls in his poetry. But perhaps these were misunderstood as an erotic predilection. I would rather see a sort of provocation when Al-Walid names, on last Sunday I saw a girl kissing a piece of wood. Oh, would I have been at the place of the wood? Can you imagine a Muslim caliph who wants to be in the form of Corpus Christi? That is, of course, a provocation and not a sort of just witty idea. The continuities of development of trends from late antiquity were already formulated in the early 20s by Karl-Heinrich Becker and in the 10s of 1910 to 1918, And so the great architectural historians Creswell followed the ideas. He brought a funny list in his early Muslim architecture volume of the many interpretations until his period. Only Oleg Grabar in 1987 was the first to doubt the Umayyad period, and in a similar provocative way, which was very typical for him, I think he formulated, why isn't it Abbasid, some 50 years later? And this now brings us to the program, which is in the project, which is at the moment under work by Johannes Kramer of the Technical University in Berlin and Barbara Perlich. In the excavations on the spot, they have found in the courtyard an Abbasid coin under a floor, the early Abbasid coin of, I think, 770s. And what does that mean? We are at present at a row. We are still at speaking terms. I would say this is impossible, but we must keep the field open for possible Abbasid usage of the site. Dorothee Sack has dwelt on the plan and has defined that such a sumptuous architecture with a triconch, most probably vaulted and domed room, a large basilica hall leading to it, and the many vaulted rooms around it. This is a residential type of architecture, and we cannot but think that this is, sorry for the bad pictures, I think I should have looked better into that. This is a residential architecture. It's not a palace like those of other palaces, smaller palaces in the Syrian and Palestinian and Jordanian region. At the other end of the courtyard is another facade, which already in drawings at the beginning of the 20th century were reconstructed with arches here and medallions like in the facade. And by chance, Barbara Perlich found the design of arches engraved at the facade. This has been published recently, so I don't want to dwell on it. It's not our subject, but it's one of these very exciting examples of building designs at a building, and they showed that the arch should be nearly pointed. This is what has been reconstructed by the team of Berlin Technical University with mainly original stones and showing the point here. Therefore, they did reconstruct it like a Gothic arch. The plan of Triconch is, of course, similar to some churches, the largest of which is the Church of Moses on Mount Nebo, which already in the earliest phase apparently shows this very similar construction, even in the outer forms. Still, it means to us that the Triconch had been used for an imperial ceremonial used by the Caliph in his ways. The idea of the facade with its triangles was found in Samarran stucco work, but unfortunately the triangles in Meshata facade are up to nearly 5 meters of height, whereas the stucco motif reconstructed by Ernst Herzfeld, it's not preserved in the original, is just 80 centimeters. But still it has the hexagonal and the lobed medallion sequence in triangles, and it may be a distant remembrance to such a construction. Otherwise, the facade as it stands now in Berlin Museum in a rather narrow surrounding is unique, and the triangles remain unique for our art historical comparison. Now for the figurative, for the sculptures. In our view, a kind of unity can be detected in the figurative program. And I would call it a program according to my theory about the arcades. And I think these triangles seem somehow to frame a message which was formulated in a program starting on the left-hand side. First, we have a look at the entrance to which these triangles lead from both sides, which is unfortunately narrowed down in the museum, but it will be reconstructed. My successor has a wonderful program, set up a wonderful program, and hopefully one will allow him to use the space available in the museum and not leave it to some museum nostalgia where the rooms are more valuable than the objects in them. It starts and it ends with these very strange Sima motifs springing out of the walls. Here is the half tower of the wall around the whole palace, and also here is the next half tower. And the Sima springs out of the wall, jumps up, and frames the whole facade. Here also the same, just that on the right-hand side, in this historical photograph of 1903, where it was still preserved on spot, on the right-hand side, none of the triangles was built further than the first row of medallions, line of medallions. Quite a strange reconstruction, makes the facade a bit smaller for nothing really remaining in it, but we should not remember it too often. We start with just having a general view of some motives in the left-hand side triangles, where animals like birds and some mythical and real animals are represented in typical fashion. They are at the beginning brought into nearly geometric forms, like here into these intertwined circles, here a bit freer into sort of scrolls, very similar to the scrolls of the mosaics in the Dome of the Rock I was showing at the beginning. Some of the animals you can recognize as showing forms in Iranian tradition, the Sasanian sea morgue, the gigantic mythical bird, or the griffin. The griffin is very well recognizable with its 4 legs and the bird's head, whereas the sea morgue, he started the same way, the sculptor, and suddenly he noticed, oh gosh, a sea morgue has only 2 legs. It was too late. The rump was already extended, so he made a little, it looks like a pig's tail, instead of the hind legs of this animal. Still, it has its typical Iranian feature. And we see also a lion and a bull. I will come back to this in a minute. Some other mythical creatures. Now, I should point out to you this fine centaurus, which doesn't show a militant form, but is rather peaceful, like an astrological figure. On the other hand, again, lions and mythical griffins. Now, 2 triangles which are not following each other. The left one is on the left-hand side, part of the facade, the right one on the right-hand side facade. And all those triangles on the right-hand side have no animated figures represented. They have scrolls, and the scroll work is differentiated from the scroll work in the left-hand side. Here we have vines in a nature, in a natural form, I would say, whereas here the stylization has taken the place and is forming the scrolls into ornamental forms. I would say the vines on the left are closer to nature. Still, vegetal plants and vegetal motifs do not count as animated, neither in early Christian art nor in Islamic belief and the Islamic encyclopedias on animals and similar. We look into some more of these stylized forms, and you can imagine why the German art historians were rather bored by them. They didn't know this way of representation, and they had the impression this will take a long time to study. Maybe they were interested in some signs which again show Sasanian forms, and one was very much interested in following up the history of motifs and not so much in the idea why these triangles were now represented in this way. The first explanation done by Ernst Herzfeld already was that on the right-hand side, a room behind the facade was detected to have been used as a mosque. It has a now reconstructed prayer niche. Maybe that looked really like that, I doubt it, but one has the impression it was never in use. Still, the artists who designed the subjects for the triangles were thought to have taken respect, or to have respected the religious formulation that the representation of figures is not really helpful for the artist. There's nothing like the prohibition of images in early Islam. This is only formulated much later, but in this era of experiment, as I said, I think we need to look for another explanation than just the former feature of a mosque behind it to prevent the representation of living figures. The combination of motives on these last triangle forms is really fascinating. You see geometric forms, you see quite a different view of plants. They are not scrolls anymore, they are real plants, but with unreal forms of leaves and ornamental devices which we cannot interpret at the moment, where one really needs more comparative material which doesn't really exist. One would look for them in the Iranian milieu. As we know from Abbasid chronicles, the Umayyads were accused of having an Iranian taste, and the forerunner, the uncle of the named Walid II, the Caliph Hisham, was blamed for having his body embalmed in the Sasanian way, and so the Abbasid revolution destroyed his mausoleum and somehow desecrated his body. Some drawings have recently been done which show the probable original form of the scrolls and of the motifs. So I just follow a few comparable items for your imagination of Sasanian motifs represented here. The griffin I had mentioned, and even the vessels represented, the vases, which one would really believe must have been colored. Now we have looked very carefully into this. The facade does not show any signs of original coloring, but a mosaic from the same Mount Nebo churches shows us that such a vessel with very similar forms was of colorful glass and not only in silver. Other vases, no, that's the same, sorry, show animals of a very strange form, which we cannot really decipher. Volkmar Enderlein thought this is perhaps the hare and fox opposed to each other. I'm not so sure. This does not look very much like a rape animal, but rather like a cozy cat or something more friendly. Rather unfriendly would be the traditions of the male cow, sorry, with a lion in some representations, and also, as we have seen in other mosaics, destroyed or not destroyed images. Here, the opposition in the Christian imagery from Madaba is as an opposing the forces of the animals, whereas here we have quite a different imagery. The zebu and the lion are drinking from a vessel, from a man-made vessel, which really brings them together, and from the same vessel the whole vine scroll springs up. Well, if this imagery is not somehow meaningful and not only an ornament, I don't know, my name would be Herr. The opposition of lion and Taurus appears quite often in the mosaics, and for the centaur, the Sagittarius, as the astrological form of it is named, we don't find really neither the bow nor an arrow, but the form, how his hands and arms are extended. It looks as if it was taken from such a Sagittarius form, but changed into a different image. Here, a little bit better to be followed. Well, and for lions, just two sorts of lions, I don't know, or a family of lions drinking from the vessel. I was recently presented by Katharina Meinecke, who will present the traditional images of these animals in late antiquity in our project, with a tombstone from Zagreb. Very similar positioning of the lions is visible. Even human figures or semi-human figures appear. Well, you may see their thin legs and sort of bold figure represented within this scroll. The scroll which encircled in the mosaics some of these motifs encircles a sort of a figure, which I could also call a faun, like a faun, not a real human. The legs are really very thin. I wonder whether one may call it like that. And in the end, we come, there's something rather similar in this, I don't know what Robert Schick says about it. Is it a normal human, or could it be half-human figure? Then the heads, represented in various marginal or frame bordure representations, and usually interpreted in the Christian context as depicting the four stages of the year, spring, summer, harvest, winter, and also in the Madaba Church of Cheder, so-called Cheder Church, these four heads are represented in the corners. Now, for the coming to the end, for the daring interpretation of the figurative program and the non-figurative program on the facade. If we understand it as to impress the Muslim and the non-Muslim subjects of the Caliph who may have passed by or approached the entrance, We might search for a meaning of this double appearance of nature represented in the fields. As suggested, the motives of both wings were known from representations in Christian religious buildings and also in some palaces perhaps, and the unanimated motives of the eastern wing alone appear also in Islamic religious architecture and in ancient Oriental representations. What if the ruling caliph wished to express more of his worldly power than the religious admonishment to avoid a possible competition with the creator, that is the normal accuse to artists representing figures? The typology of the king or ruler in the Quran is partly connotated somewhat negatively. The hybrid Nimrod and the oppressive Pharaoh are the main ruling figures. Heribert Busse, the Islamic scholar, has distinguished 4 types of rulers: the tyrant, the king installed by a prophet, that is Shaul, Talut in the Quran, or the queen converting to Islam by conviction, Balkis, the queen of Sheba. Finally, the prophet king, the kings David and Salomo, Suleiman. Of the older David, it is said that he ruled the unanimated nature. Mountains are given as an example, and the animated, like birds. Quran, Surah 21, verse 79, and with David we subjected the mountains to give glory and the birds. And his son Suleiman is characterized to have asked for more power after his repentance for a committed sin. He was doing a wrong judgment, as you know, in one case, and this is recorded in the Quran as well. He asked for more power, meaning over the whole cosmos below heaven. Quran 38, verse 34 following. He said, "My Lord, forgive me, and give me a kingdom such as may not befall anyone after me. Surely thou art the all-giver." Now, if we don't take it verbally, the characteristics of David and Suleiman, one can imagine, would fit a supreme claim of the caliph as a new type of ruler. The caliphs had to look for an Islamic form of their rule, as their legislative power from old Arab traditions was none, was zero. The power given in the Quran to the righteous kings was apparently the rule over the animated and the unanimated world. The animals and the human head on the western wing, now this is the final representation, the head should help you to detect it up here. The lion does not belong to it, don't be afraid of this composite animal, it's separated. The animals and the human head in the western wing of the most visible wall of the caliph's palace, and on the other side, the unanimated scrolls with a few Sasanian imperial motifs on the eastern wing, could be taken to represent these two things in the world. Very hesitantly, one might even detect the mountains of the Quranic verse in the triangle forms. I don't want to insist on this, but just as an illusion. Without having to search for the ideological sources in the early Islamic period, the experimental recourse to the prophet king as models of their self-interpretation would help us to understand this new language. I wonder, I have several explanations for this, and surely you would ask for them, but I will just leave you with this impression. The idea behind it is that we should take serious the command of the Medinan society formed by the Prophet Muhammad, formed with the help of several representatives of the 3 religions in the region, should have been taken serious, even and especially in the surroundings of so forceful pre-Islamic traditions like in Byzantine provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Jordania. Thank you very much for your attention.
We're not going to have questions, but if any of you would like to come down and speak with the speakers, or go up to the galleries where we have 3 of the stones from Mashata and a torso of one of the women, and some of the photographs and drawings that the Germans have recently done, and they generously provided us to put on the labels. We look forward to your looking at the exhibition and thinking about all the issues we're raising now. Thank you.